So thank you very much to everyone involved in the organization of this conference. I wanted to start with this slide here. You could tell that this is some kind of like a dinner, no? After the dinner talk with some friends, and you wouldn't be wrong. Actually, it's this, but also it's something else that is like a really important part of my job as a coordinator of an artist in residency program of CERCA that was born actually in 2009 thanks or as a result of this master's I did in London, in the London South Bank University, in critical art management and media cultural studies. The master's for me was a turning point in my development as both a person, like an artist in residency coordinator, as is engaged or kind of like intertwined in a really organic way, theory and practice. The theoretical part of my dissertation of the master's, in one part was a research on alternative methodologies that would allow me to understand better the local context of the residency of this village, my hometown, through an analysis of this lineage of thinking that goes from George Simmel, then kind of like Walter Benjamin, and finally Michel de Certeau. This triology is just kind of like is crucial, and you will see that kind of like has influence as well on my current work too. The paper was going together with experimental documentary, some kind of like visual autoethnography, somehow portraying as well the life and the rituals and the strategies that kind of like the people from the village were putting in practice. This was in one side. The other side was this practical implementation of a project which became CERCA. During these 8 years, I realized something was kind of like there all the time, no? And thanks also to this master, that kind of like what I call this decentering of dichotomies. In that sense, for example, what is personal and what is professional, what is professional and what is amateur, and what is private and public. In my case, as coordinator of CERCA, became completely or somehow kind of like nonsensical. So I felt much more closer, not as much to these dichotomies, but the most kind of like a holistic way of understanding my job and my life, no? Another aspect that I find important to underline here is how artists in residencies have kind of like three main concepts, no? That kind of like define them. One of them could be mobility of artists and individuals that are nowadays being discussed on terms of kind of like having somehow a nomadic life. The second part, or the second concept, is hospitality and the relationship between the guest and the host, and finally also cultural exchange. This is a kind of like a feel-good way of understanding residencies, but what I want to underline here is not as much as this aspect of the residencies, but its contradictions. Contradictions that are defined by several aspects. One of them is really well summarized in this quote here from TJ Demo. Singing the praises of nomadism today without the narrow scope of the European framework, without the radical political demands for equality, as it is often done in contemporary art discourse, appears self-congratulatory, even narcissistic. In such cases, nomadism suggests a contemporary neo-primitivism, one that subscribes to a fantasy of freedom from all attachments, but which cruelly operates in a system that denies that freedom, to the very itinerant peoples from whom it borrows its name. This borrowing here is kind of like is the crucial word in my understanding, and I wanted to kind of search on kind of like how these concepts of mobility, hospitality, and cultural exchange are defined, are practices and reappropriated, not as much as from an European perspective, but in the perspective of the Arab world. It's also like really interesting to realize that kind of like artists in residencies are explained in the main websites, the main network platforms, from a process that starts in the West or center or in a West-centric historiography. What I will try to do is to kind of like see this history from a more transcultural approach. So this is my research topic, Rethinking Epistemologies, Mobility, Hospitality, and Cultural Exchange in the Maghreb. One of the things that worried me the most during this first year of PhD that I'm doing in the Edinburgh University is to find a method that would fit both my interest as as a researcher, but also kind of like that would deeply engage with the topic and the people that I was researching. In that case, the focus is put in the Maghreb and in the Arab world. So I was trying to apply this borrowing, which is named by TJ Demos, borrowing of a methodology that would be context specific, so kind of like alternative. I was searching for alternative methodological research traditions. In this case, like Islamic methodological traditions. To my surprise, after like quite in-depth research in different libraries in Edinburgh, or participation in different methodological workshops and conferences, what I noticed, what I was really surprised about, is that these Islamic research methods were named anywhere, and it was kind of like really kind of like shocking. Like there was like really few bibliography and really few resources on that matter. This is one of my main worries, why there is this invisibility of site-specific sources of methodology or alternative ways of understanding the method from a transcultural perspective. In that case, to give answer to this question, I found it in two really important texts which have come out just like last 2 years ago. One of them is by Ramon Grossvogel, The Structures of Knowledge in the Westernized Universities, and the other one is Epistemologies of the South, a really well-known text which underlines something that is quite taken for granted at some point, which is kind of like also enlightenment has a dark side. So kind of like this dark side of enlightenment, which is kind of like what they chronologically situate between, or what they call the long 16th century, between the 1450s and 1650s. Is a crucial period to understand then the further development of enlightenment as a modernizing process. What they kind of like stress is in this concept called epistemicide, that is the destruction of knowledge, which kind of like happened through genocide. The first of these genocides is placed in 1492 in Granada, where the Muslims and the Jews were expulsed from the city, and where all the knowledge that they had been kind of like accumulating for so many time was completely destroyed with this kind of like well-known strategy of burning books. I put this photo here because this slide here because kind of like it shows really nicely who is the ones that were extracting all this knowledge. You see kind of like white middle class or bourgeois or gentry, kind of like wealthy kind of like individuals together with the church. So this is the first epistemicide, and there's like three more. One is kind of like when the discoverment of America and the destruction of kind of like the knowledge created in this kind of like other civilizations. The other one is the displacement of black people through slavery, and the third one is not about burning books but burning people themselves, which is the burn of witches in the medieval times in the whole Europe. Yes, this kind of like is more kind of like these theories for me were this fascinating, as I'm kind of like really keen on history, and just kind of like they showed an idea of history that is somehow hidden. As you have seen, kind of like I'm trying to kind of like contrast or complement these theories or these kind of like ideas into a practice. So what I did was I was lucky enough to be part of this symposium, Critical Muslim Studies, the Colonial Struggles and Liberation Theology summer school that took place actually in Granada this last summer. And that was kind of like a really fascinating gathering of Muslim scholars and researchers. For example, Said Shakir from Berkeley, Salman Said from Leeds, or Farid Essaq from Cape Town. There was kind of like a huge variety of kind of like thinking, a huge variety of approximations to critical Muslim studies. But one line that kind of like was there quite often was the one that was underlining academia, Western academia, as a racist, sexist, monolingual, and situated and asocial structure of knowledge production. Furthermore, I realized some kind of like contradictions. One of them is that kind of like through my development as an academic, as a researcher, I was, as I said before, I was always interested in looking for alternative ways of understanding kind of like methodological research, in this case through this lineage that I was naming before, like Samuel Benjamin Desserteau, and that was entering kind of like in big contradiction with this definition of Western academia as kind of like purely essentialized in through this kind of like really pejorative kind of like adjectives. So yeah, kind of like there was this contradiction. Another contradiction was, for example, in a more practical term, was how the place was set up. If you are attending a summer school of that lasted for more than 15 days, with more than 5 lectures in each day, so that's quite a lot of information. So and is a summer school that actually focuses in alternative ways of understanding knowledge production and dissemination. What you would expect, or in my case, what I was expecting was a much different setup of kind of like of these talks. Instead, kind of like we or they replicated, well, kind of like a place that as this one that we are now, with kind of like a speaker, with a PowerPoint, and with the audience down there. Creating, in my understanding, some kind of like a wall, some kind of like a barrier that, in my way of thinking, is not kind of like the best kind of like structure when if you want to kind of like really challenge traditional ways of understanding this dialogue. The question was there, how which methodology apply, how apply a methodological kind of like approximation that would kind of like fit my object of research, and in this case the solution wasn't much found in books or in conferences, but in the street. So kind of like walking, doing a little bit of flaneur, as Benjamin would say, in this square, this kind of like really famous square in Marrakesh. Which is kind of like everywhere named as kind of like a square of dialogue, no, square of kind of like encounter between different civilizations. And one day I was invited, well, kind of like during 1 month I was invited, I was selected to be part of the research residency as part of this organization, Artist in Residency program, which is called Ladies Wit, and this project called Cow Cow. One day I was walking in this square, I saw kind of like this circle of people, and I wonder what was that. So I asked someone, and this person told me, well, this is storytelling. Kind of like it has a long tradition here in the Arab world, and actually this storytelling comes from this kind of like really I would say kind of like interesting concept, which is halqa. Halqa is a spiritual circle time institute by Prophet Muhammad in his education of early Muslims. It's conducted purely orally, with the students and teachers sitting in a circle on the floor. An integral part of the traditional Islamic education, Halqa continues to be core practice in Muslim cultures. Halqa is credited with transformation of personalities, empowerment of individuals and communities through a social justice agenda, and the development of Islamic intellectual heritage, including sciences, arts, and mysticism. Well, as you can imagine, for my research, this was kind of like something that for me was kind of like fascinating. So I was wondering, can be Halqa a research, a methodological, method? My surprise was that some days later, also kind of like researching, I found out this really interesting short text written by a young Muslim woman studying in Cambridge, PhD researcher in Cambridge. Her name is Farah Ahmed, and her project is exploring Halqa as a research method. The study involved Muslim mother teachers participating in Halqa to collaboratively reflect on their work as holistic Islamic educators who are developing a critical indigenous education to meet the needs of Muslim children in contemporary Britain. Halqa enable participants to articulate themselves within their own epistemological and ontological context and engage in critical reflection within the Islamic paradigm. As you can see, this for me was kind of like an open door for kind of like discovering or kind of like achieving my aim, which was kind of like this of like looking for site-specific ways of understanding the method and methodology. Furthermore, what Ahmed is doing is not kind of like creating this dichotomy between Western academia and indigenous research methods, but instead kind of like trying to look for the linking points, and you can see it in this graphic here, where she uses Halka as a critical theory method. She uses Halka as a reflexive conversation, as a dialogical discourse, also as an inquiry and autoethnographic approach, which I find it kind of like really great, and also kind of like participant empowerment and spirituality. So yes, I decided to take this as my method, but before that I continued investigating a little bit more on kind of like what an Islamic research method would look like. And this is defined as the Islamic research principles, which are also kind of like a big part of the research of Ahmed, which are kind of like summarized in these 6 points. The first one is the primacy of the Quran as the prophetic sayings, highly problematic. We can talk about that later. Second is combination of classical Islamic scholarship and sciences with a range of other research methods. Third, the use of all human faculties of understanding. Fourth, the necessity of centering the human situation in research. Fifth, some kind of like ethics, she called it kind of like Islamic ethics. And fifth and sixth, to enforce collaborative, participative, and transformative useful research. So how did I apply these points into my own research on artists in residencies in the Maghreb region and in the redefinition of concept of mobility, hospitality, and cultural exchange? So the first step has been to establish kind of like this platform that now has become like a network of centers, of artists in residency centers, coordinated first of all by CERCA, our organization, but then together with 6 other spaces in the Maghreb, in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia, and in Egypt. Together we applied for this grant for the Anna Lina Foundation grant, and our objective was actually the ones that are point 5 and 6 of the Islamic research methods, to enforce collaborative, participative, and transformative and useful research. Research should serve the people researched. It should empower and offer practical and real solutions and improvements, and include the researched in all stages of the research process, including dissemination and application. So kind of like here you can see the first, through this grant that we got from Anna Lina Foundation, our aim was kind of like to establish this kind of like Halkas, you could tell them, through these meetings that would take place, first of all, in Barcelona. That was kind of like last September and October. Then the next one is going to be in Algiers in February. The second one is going to be in Tunis in March. The fourth one is going to be in Marrakesh in May, and the last one is going to be in Barcelona again. So kind of like, as you can see, the circle is always kind of like an inspiration here. These circles where we kind of like discuss our hopes, our worries, our aims, and our kind of like objectives in establishing this platform. We were lucky enough to be invited as well to the SWOP International Art Fair here in Barcelona as part of the Focus Maghreb, this program that included several of the partners of the network. So we were invited to showcase our project, the North Africa Cultural Mobility Map, which also includes a website, an online platform, which is composed of a map of artists in residencies. Then you also have funding opportunities. You have kind of like research resources, and you have kind of like different aspects that would help not only artists but also researchers, academics, and curators to kind of like engage through collaboration with kind of like different kind of like organizations from the region. The aim is obviously to break kind of like this like huge misconceptions that exist, and this kind of like just kind of like this dichotomy that again doesn't make any sense, no, between kind of like the Arab world and Europe. Key aspect of this and and somehow kind of like relating to another point of the Islamic research methods, points actually 2 and 4, is the combination of classical Islamic scholarship and sciences with a range of other research methods. This is done by grounded theory with literature review and also video interviews. So kind of like during the last year, I've been conducting more than 30 interviews to artists, researchers, and artists in residency coordinators. These interviews can be kind of like self-promotional of the spaces, but also self-reflexive in the way kind of like that we are asking questions that relate to kind of like my topic, one of them of kind of like hospitality, research, mobility and cultural exchange in the region, but also kind of like we engage in, we ask, no, for kind of like what do they think about, for example, concepts such as kind of like the epistemologies of the South. Is surprisingly kind of like it's a concept that is not really familiar to any of them, and that if it is familiar, it's a concept that they don't really feel engaged into. So kind of like again, kind of like this contradiction of this way of understanding kind of like knowledge production from this post-colonial way of thinking, no, from Grossfogel and Santos. And finally, just kind of like to end, as you can see, there's kind of like this part of more activism through the platform. There's another part that is much more research focused. Well, this research actually is trying to answer or kind of like to approach different topics. One of them is archaeologies of globalization, historiographies of knowledge exchange in the Maghreb and the Arab world. 2 is artistic developments in the Maghreb, self-censorship, self-orientalism, and the oblivion of the self. 3, the appropriations of hospitality, migrants, nomads, and the flaneur from an Islamic perspective. So this would be the theoretical part, but then there's like the third part, which is actually kind of like super important for me, which is kind of like would relate to point 3 of the Islamic research methods, which is the use of all human faculties of understanding, that is the intellectual, the rational, the intuitive, and the spiritual. Human understanding of the natural, social, and human worlds cannot be reduced to the empirical, rational dimensions only. A more holistic approach needs to be accepted to recognize multiple forms of human meaning and knowledge. And in my case, this is done, again, following some kind of like a Benjaminian kind of like strategy through kind of like tracing through video, experimental video work that could be related to, for example, visual anthropology or kind of like creative autoethnography or digital storytelling, kind of like creating kind of like this small kind of like map or small kind of like puzzle with missing pieces, obviously, that kind of like wrap up the whole project, and which tries to kind of like with any kind of interest in kind of like creating a grand narrative, so kind of like just kind of like pinpoint some kind of like aspects that they find fascinating from the region, both historical, autobiographical, or kind of like through more kind of like a visual poetry approach. So well, kind of like this is what I wanted to explain you, kind of like my process as a kind of like a researcher trying to find kind of like an interesting method. I hope that it fits, no, in the overall discussion. Thank you very much for listening. These are my websites, Cerca, Paucata, and North Africa Cultural Mobility Map, and I'm super looking forward your feedback and your comments. Thank you very much.